We're going, we're live, and I missed y'all last week. I apologize that I had to miss class, had a day-long training class I was conducting and just knew I would not be able to get back. So I hope that what I said last semester was what I would have said this semester. I don't think I've changed all that much from a few months ago. We do have a few things going on in the course before I finish up. I think we started the first industrial revolution last week and talked about some of the management principles and things that were going on that led to the first industrial revolution. And then today we're going to finish it up by talking about some of the processes and technologies that defined that era and the effect that it had on the people and the people aspects of engineering management. So that's what we have in front of us for this evening. And so that'll be all of module 1, which means we have our first exit exam next week. So no class. No class. You will have the exam will be available next Tuesday for 24 hours. So it'll be available all day. Once you start taking it, you'll have 90 minutes to complete it, unless you have accommodations, and I will moderate that accordingly in Canvas. The exam is on Canvas. Multiple choice or multiple answer. I think I talked about this the first day of class, but the way I do my exams usually is about 70% of the questions are fairly straightforward. Like if you watch the lectures, filled in the blanks in the notes, have a working walk around knowledge of what we've discussed. Call those C questions. Another 15% may be a little more conceptual. In other words, it won't be necessarily straightforward, but you'll read something and go, oh, that's looks like it's describing this. And then the other, so those are B type questions. And then the other 15% will be more critical thinking. You may have to read a passage and it might say answer the next 2 or 3 questions, and it'll gauge your comprehension of concepts. That's kind of the way I create the exams. I don't do a lot of open-ended essay questions in my graduate classes, which is, I think, the opposite of the way a lot of people do that teach these management type classes. And I do that for a couple of reasons. One, sometimes, not this semester, but a lot of times I have 60, 70 people in this class, and it's a lot of reading for a guy from the Pullman County school system that don't like to read. That's why I got into engineering, so I don't have to read. Just give me numbers, give me math problems. But really the reason is if you can read a passage and connect what we've talked about at the fundamental level, to me that shows that you understand it better, even if you have to stare and think and go, well, there's a couple of these that both could be right and you have to battle with yourself, then good, I wrote it that way. Whereas if I leave it open-ended, people can write enough about something without understanding it to vaguely hit on something to argue that they understand it when they just wrote down a bunch of stuff. So that's my philosophy. It's a little opposite than most, but that's kind of what to expect. It's the first one. I think you'll all be fine. I got, in the 90 minutes, I think I got most of them finished and made us 75. So, should be fine. It's a joke. I realized I have to say that. I've been telling that joke for many years, and then like a couple of years ago, somebody was like, if you only made it 85, how were you expecting us? Dude, calm down. Like, walk around the block. Let's relax. The days when we could joke. I missed them. Missed them a lot. There will be, this is also ironic. I will tell the people here and live, and you will not be the people who do this. There will be a passcode in the instructions at the top of the exam that will give you access to it. There is a strong likelihood that I will not be by my email or my phone the moment any individual may start the exam to be able to reply to you to give you the access code. So I'm telling you where it's at to begin with. Because I get that a lot. So
Is it all right to use our notes and stuff?
yes, so right at the top, it's cleverly named EM 660 Mod 1. So that's where you can find it. Yes, so another one of those philosophies I have that may be differing than others. I'm fine if you use your notes or whatever. I don't use lockdown browser or anything like that. Here's my thought on it. This is graduate school. I decided a while back to design the way that I teach to benefit the ones who want to learn and are here to genuinely want to gain knowledge and make themselves better engineer managers, and not bring the negative aspect of doing a lot of crazy things to mitigate cheating. Now that will catch up in other classes. I'll let other professors catch up to it. I don't think you should hear you're cheating yourself, but the direction that we've gone with online courses and everything, especially at the graduate level, it's just hard to do in person one way and online the other way. And so I just do all my assignments online. And if you're going to do an exam online, you might as well not pretend that people can have their notes available. And I think that's realistic. I mean, there's some that either you get it or you don't. And there's no amount of notes that will help you. Either you heard me explain it in class or you get it and understand it, or it's not going to be as straightforward in the notes. So I don't worry about it. So yeah, you can have whatever you like available to you. Good question. Any other questions on the exam itself? So the other pending item is the case study. So phase 1 is due, I believe, tonight at midnight. So I think 7 of the 24 turned it in. So the student syndrome data is accurate. I think it's or close, like 9 or 70, some 5% of students turn assignments in on the due date. It's what student syndrome is in research terms. So we're right there at 25, a little over 25% that's turned it in. So you got till the end of the night to start that and finish it. Phase 2 will start at midnight after phase 1 is due, and you'll be assigned your peer reviews. I put those in today. I don't know if you got notifications today or not. Didn't know how that worked. And then did you go and look and it says not available or something? Just as I planned. So luckily, for the first time in a while, I try to do it in groups of 4 so that you get assigned 3 people's and those 3 people get assigned yours. It just makes phase 3 easier. We actually have a number divisible by 4, so I didn't have to do a lot of jumping through hoops. So please, nobody drop out between the next 2 weeks. So you should have those accessible starting tomorrow. And you'll have, I don't know how this ends up in there when I changed. It's due on 2 something. I don't, not 9:30.
February 30th.
It's not February 30th. It is. I don't know how that. It's.
I want the 210.
You are correct. I changed it. I physically changed it somewhere today, which makes me, yes, February the 10th. See some real fine magic changes happen because it won't let me edit it because I'm using the cheap version. Pay attention to Canvas. Canvas is gospel. So 2 weeks to do the written peer review. Remember the guidelines, practice radical candor. I'm not just looking for you to do grammatical corrections and spelling corrections. I'm looking for you to give substantive feedback, practice radical candor, practice the situation, behavior, impact, is how to give meaningful feedback to help each other improve your work, your product. And use the rubric. Like I gave the rubric in assignment 1 that I will actually use to grade the final one. I gave it to you so you could have some guidelines in creating your first submission, but also when you're evaluating and doing the peer review for your classmates, consider that as well. Like, oh, this will be what he's grading it by. Maybe if you include this or this, it could demonstrate this. I want to point out a couple of things. So, yeah, the rubric that was available for 1 is the same one that I'm going to use to grade the final. But when you're making the feedback, I'm not looking for you necessarily, I'm not looking for you to grade each other on the rubric. I'm looking for you to use the annotation window. So this is a little tricky, but phase 2 is actually accessed through the phase 1 assignment because that's where the peer reviews are assigned. Now I'll put a reminder in that to force a due date for phase 2. It's a dummy assignment that just directs you back to the peer review tutorial that I hope I talked about last week. I hope that version of me discussed last week, you can also access it here. But it takes you back to phase 1 and you'll be able to access your peer reviews here. And you will not see what I'm about to do, but you will not be able to see everybody's, I'm assuming. I mean, if I'm the student, I've been assigned these 3 people, I can click on it, click view feedback, and here's the life hack. This gives you the full screen to edit with the arrows. And I say that because there's been multiple times I've had people give me feedback on the Canvas window and say, it's just so small. You just have to navigate. And so tell me you didn't watch the tutorial video without telling me. But that's where you can input your feedback and everything. I want it there, not in the rubric. I want you to use the rubric as a guideline to help give feedback, but not to grade or not to leave the information in the rubric. And don't leave it over here either. Leave it in the annotation. Okay, so those are the 2 administrative items I think that we have going on. Does anybody have any questions on that? We'll be 25% of the way through the semester already after tonight. So I feel like we just get started. So we're going to finish up the first industrial revolution by talking about the processes and technologies and the people aspects. But I want to do a quick review of what I hope I talked about last week, of the setting around the first industrial revolution and some of the management principles that started to emerge, even though we weren't really calling them management principles yet, but just some of the societal principles that were happening. From a way of life standpoint, we saw the agricultural revolution. So prior to the Industrial Revolution, a high percentage of people lived in an agrarian society, specific to Great Britain, which is where the first Industrial Revolution is credited to begin. And the time frame that we're talking about with the Industrial Revolution, and it varies plus or minus a decade or so. And I'm not going to like ask you some gotcha question of what time frame is the first Industrial Revolution and have it 1740 or 1750. I'm not going to do that because it varies. I like nice even numbers, so I go with like 1750 to 1850, but people will say plus or minus a decade or so from that. Mid 1700s, Great Britain, prior to that was the agricultural revolution. And so what that meant was more agriculture, crops and livestock could be generated with fewer people due to a lot of technologies introduced in that world. So fewer people were needed to farm, and the Enclosures Act made it more difficult for the common folk to be able to enclose common land and use it for farms and on land that they didn't own themselves. So both of those things drove people into the cities looking for work, and we call that urbanization, where we saw populations in the urban areas of Great Britain increase dramatically at the beginning of this time frame, which created its own challenges. It created overcrowding, it created sicknesses and diseases, but then ultimately started to improve way of living toward the middle and end of the first Industrial Revolution. Toward the beginning of the first Industrial Revolution, one of the things that shaped management principles and societal principles from an economic standpoint was the seminal publication, The Wealth of Nations, from Adam Smith, Scottish economist. And he defined a new way of looking at economy. So before The Wealth of Nations, the primary view of economics in that area was more of a mercantilism, more of a wealth is finite, and for me to get richer, I have to take something from you. That was the idea. And so I want to save all the resources for me because I want to be wealthy. Not that I'm trying to prevent you to. I just think if you were to get wealthy, it means you have to take something from me. That was mercantilism. Whereas the Wealth of Nations I introduced the idea of the free market view of economy, which said wealth can actually be generated so that everyone can actually generate more wealth than they currently have without taking from someone else. And he said three things need to exist for that to work. One, I believe he called enlightened self-interest, which means I assume people will pursue professions that are more valuable, supply and demand. I have an interest in creating wealth for myself. And then supply and demand will be driven if division of labor exists, which means instead of me trying to do everything and be good at everything, I will actually have a craft or a trade. I want to become a blacksmith. I want to become a woodworker. I want to become whatever it is, and I'm going to focus on that. That's what we kind of do these days, right? And then the third thing is we each have our own specific trades. We become specialized in them. Each trade's going to have its own earning value based on supply, demand, desirability. Had a list of things that like some jobs worth more than others. Some are just more difficult than others. So only a few people can do them. And so the idea was with enlightened self-interest, I want to create wealth for myself. I will pursue careers that are in high demand with a low supply, because that'll make me valuable. And the market will balance itself out with people seeking skills to supply skills that other people are seeking. And so then we have our trades that we can then swap back and forth. I'm a baker, I've baked things. You make shirts, I can use a shirt, want some donuts? But because things don't necessarily trade on a one-on-one, the third part of the free market society was we need some kind of common currency. So even if I want your donuts and you don't need my shirt, I can give you something equivalent to that, money of some sort, to level that out. And the last thing, so division of labor driven by enlightened self-interest, that I'll choose the right specialization to make me wealthy. And if I do, we'll have a nice balance in society. And he called it the invisible hand. We'll feed everybody. We will make each other rich. With the currency to make it easier to swap back and forth, the byproducts of our trades. And then the third thing was laissez-faire, which is government, keep your grubby hands off of it. Don't be involved. Government should enforce contracts that you and I make together to do business, but otherwise shouldn't leave it to private individuals and organizations to conduct that business and not intervene. So that became the predominant view of economics at the time, which changed a lot of things. So it actually created a situation. So a lot of this stuff's happening all at once, and that's what we will see over all the industrial revolutions, is that it's not just one thing that causes it, but it's this culmination of a certain group of things that happen all at once that, when combined, create the environment to say this is a shift. So economic shift, population shift into a different area. So we had urbanization, as we mechanized farming and didn't need as many people. So we had people moving into the cities. We had a different view of economy. So what that did, whereas in mercantilism, only 1% of the people owned land and most of the wealth, and that was passed down to the same families over and over, this whole idea of the free market, for me, who might not have come from that area, but have creative thinking and ideas and never had any reason to even exercise those, because it's not going to get me any richer. Now all of a sudden, with this idea of the free market society, it opens up my mind to be a little more innovative and encourage me to take some more risk. And so we get two new social classes, one being that first generation new money, talk about old money and new money. The first generation people who were inventors and took risk and became the industrial middle class. First generation, whether you call it wealth or not poor. Starting to get more of the 1%. Those are the people who we'll talk about today, inventors, people who started factory systems, first generation type people. And then also a second social class that was created was this industrial working class, which were those people who moved into the city, often farmers, lumberjacks, things like that, and were the people who went to work in these places. So kind of new social dynamics as well, but that's what was going on. And so as we shift to the processes and technology aspect of the first industrial revolution, it's really interesting. It all began centered around one industry. The largest industry in Great Britain at the time was textiles. Making clothes, making fabric. And the island of Great Britain, England, Scotland, Wales, very dismal for a high percentage of the year and very ideal for raising animals to harvest wool from. So they actually, to encourage purchases of wool that they were growing there, actually for a long time, I had a high tax on cotton to discourage people in the textile industry from using cotton, which they had access to both in India, rich place to grow cotton, and then also the American colonies in the Southeast United States. They were protecting their wool industry until the upper class decided, hey, this cotton stuff's a new fashion trend. It sure is lighter, sure is more comfortable. And so as the pressure from the upper class increased, and magically politics lessened the tax on cotton. And so cotton became the primary fabric for textiles. And so they started importing it from both India and the US colonies to grow that industry. It was the largest one in Great Britain at the time. And so then some major inventions came about. And so what we're going to see repeated, which is part of the reason I try to teach this through the lens of the Industrial Revolutions, is we see the same patterns happen. We're going to see technologies and automation introduced into the textile industry. And ultimately, what happens is it drives prices down, increases productivity, and makes textiles, in a variety of textiles, more accessible to more people at an affordable price, which actually increases demand. So some of the major inventions centered around two major tasks that are involved in textile production: spinning and weaving. So spinning is twisting fibers into a piece of yarn and thread. So spinning individual fibers into a thicker, hopefully stronger piece of thread. And then weaving, which is taking multiple pieces of thread and weaving them in different directions to make fabric. So at the end of the day, textile is that. And so some of the early technologies that defined the Industrial Revolution were focused on that industry. Because prior to this time, prior to the Industrial Revolution, the way work tended to happen was in the cottage industries. So people would make things at their home. They would go, they would purchase raw materials, they'd bring it home. You'd have your own sewing machines, your own spinning and weaving ways that you would do it. And then you might take it to town and sell the small batches that you do, and you make it for your families, and that's kind of how things work. So some of the major inventions: James Hargreaves invented the spinning jenny. And what the spinning jenny did, it was allowed one person with the turn of a wheel to operate up to 80 spindles instead of one by hand that would spin and make more yarn. And each machine had up to 10 spindles. And so, or 8 machines would operate 80 spindles at a time, operating 8 machines. But a lot of the yarn made on the spinning jenny was not very strong. So then, and I read one time a while back, and I've never been able to find it again. Not that I've looked that hard, but the name spinning jenny, apparently James Hargrave had a daughter named Jenny. And his original attempt at inventing this was turned 90 degrees. And she ran by and knocked it over. Then he realized it actually works better in that orientation. Named it after his daughter who was running amok and knocked over his project. Richard Arkwright invented the water frame, which actually used rollers and a wheel powered by water. It was bigger, could generate more energy, couldn't be turned by hand. And the rollers actually made the threads more consistent and stronger. So whereas the spinning jenny allowed for more yarn to be made, water frame allowed that to also be made, yarn to be made stronger. And then Samuel Crompton developed the spinning mule, which combined the technologies of both of those. And I cover this primarily to reemphasize the point of, do you notice the types of people that were doing these? Carpenter, weaver, entrepreneur, inventors, the industrial middle class. All because, oh, I'm a little more creative, more inventive, because with the free market society, if you adopt that mindset, I might be able to generate wealth for myself and not be dependent on it being handed down. So all of that had to happen simultaneously. So we can't discount the role that the change in the view of economics had on the willingness for some of these people to take more risk in their inventions. On the weaving side, the mechanic, John Kay, invented the flying shuttle, which used a lever and cords to push back and forth and weave fabric, lessen the labor needs, double productivity, and then ultimately Cartwright's power loom. He was a clergyman, fully mechanized the weaving process, even though it was a little dangerous. And so the more mechanized things got, the more dangerous it got, which we'll look at in the people aspects of things. So the primary thing I want to point out here is some of the early engineering technology inventions in the first industrial revolution were centered around the textile industry, because it was the largest industry, and the way the economic views shifted to have some of these folks willing to introduce these inventions at a larger scale. And ultimately, that increased productivity in that largest industry. So as we go through the four industrial revolutions, we're in the middle of the fourth Industry 4.0. One of the things that I always say, because we have all these technologies that are coming, and the name Industry 4.0 popped up 15 years or so ago, probably more now, 2010-ish. Talk about this new wave of technologies that's coming in, kind of all specifically in manufacturing, but now spread out all over society. You don't have to look or listen very far to hear somebody talk about artificial intelligence these days. How do I use AI in this, this, this? That's one of those technologies: machine learning, AI, virtual reality solutions, automation, robotics, 3D printing, additive manufacturing. All these were kind of emerging all at once, and those are really cool, fascinating blockchain technology, if you're into that. This new wave of technologies is kind of changing the way we live and think and work. And I always say technology is relative. So mechanizing a loom or creating a wheel to turn to spin more threads by today's standards may not seem that drastic, but it was very drastic. So technology, and just like in 50, 100 years, some of the things we're living today that's high technology will seem that basic. I'll generate some hate here with my old joke. Technology is like a Tennessee marriage. It's all relative. So with the inventions of all these machines also shifted where people did work. So now all of a sudden, we go from people who would go and get raw materials, bring it to their home in the cottage industry, use their own setups to make things. Now we have these more productive pieces of equipment that the inventors are creating and making more of, and putting them in a centralized location for people to come to the work. Instead of getting the materials to take home, now the people are going from their home to a centralized place to work, and that created a new dynamic. A factory system. So this is engineering management, which started with engineering and management, neither of which was very formalized prior to the first industrial revolution. Now, we talked about the very first class. Engineering feats have existed since before anybody can explain, like the pyramids. Leadership has existed since people have been fighting wars and militaries have existed. But workforce management and formalized engineering didn't really exist prior to this time. And it kind of makes sense when you think about it, because what was there to manage when there weren't groups of people showing up to do work in the same place? And we didn't know we needed something called management. We didn't know what dynamics that would create. So they started to realize all the people that have moved from the farms. I grew up on a small farm. There isn't an 8 o'clock and 5 o'clock where you punch in to start work and clock out when it's over. It's kind of a, you don't stop putting hay in the barn when it's 5 o'clock. You stop when the hay's in the barn. Or you just, everybody kind of worked at their own pace. So they didn't have these industry habits of showing up at the same time. And so realizing that there needed to be bounds on that was a realization. So that's a piece of management. Then we didn't know we needed these things called supervisors. So that started to emerge. And so there, a lot of times it was the loudest person or person who knew someone or the owners of the factories. But it also brought about the need for more efficient infrastructure and support. So again, we're going to see this repeat over all the industrial revolutions, because the need for infrastructure creates innovation in other areas. We need to build factories. We need more power. We need construction, transportation. We need infrastructure support. Oh, so we've got to get better at making steel. We got to get more efficient at designing transportation systems. We have to get better at building and constructing larger facilities. We need more efficient ways of generating energy. So all of these technologies that we're going to see aren't independent things that popped up. They're interrelated needs that have cause and effect. So we need more efficient means of power, because now we're talking about needing to make steel more efficiently, which means we need more steel, which means more ways of making steel, which is not it's a very energy intensive process. So along comes probably the most definitive invention of all of them in the first industrial revolution, one probably the most of all time, this steam engine. The original version of the steam engine was developed in 1712, prior to the first industrial revolution starting, by Thomas Newcomen. But it was very inefficient, and it was mainly made to try to draw water out of coal mines. So England, one of the reasons that the first industrial revolution kind of popped up in England was the availability of a lot of cheap coal. I shared both a video from Crash Course, which is kind of enlightening, in I think last section 1.3, and then an article on the role of coal in the first industrial revolution, I think this week. And so one of the biggest advantages Great Britain had was that access and availability to cheap coal. And with the development of the steam engine and making it more efficient, James Watt, who kind of gets all the credit because he made it more efficient. What drove that was if I could have a more efficient use of steam, but allow me to remove water and go deeper to get more coal. But to generate steam, I have to have coal. So I need to generate steam to get that coal so that I can generate steam to get the coal. And it was kind of it fed off. So that allowed for a lot of the improvements to happen. Advancements in the steam engine allowed to get coal, which allowed for more efficient uses of power, which allowed for more efficient ways to produce things, to build factories, to increase the infrastructure that was needed to sustain the growth. For construction to happen at a fast scale to meet up with the demand, we also had to come up with cleaner and more efficient ways of making steel or building materials. And again, coal played a role because they began using a byproduct of coal called coke. It's a gooey, gross byproduct of coal. So not the Southern slang for every beverage that you drink, Coke, not the Colombian import of powder. This is what we're talking about here is a byproduct of coal. I worked at a company in the Birmingham area that was a foundry, but then they also they use coke to make different products like ceiling tiles. It's used to put in that, but it's also used in steel making, which was much more efficient than charcoal, which was a wood byproduct that had traditionally been used prior to this time. So they were able to create blast furnaces, a Bessemer process from human Bessemer that allowed for more efficient ways to remove impurities and make steel stronger, all come about during this time. Some other really interesting things that allowed for the support of the first industrial revolution tied to coal and the steam engine came from transportation. So two major contributions there, the steamboat. And what gave that the advantage was its ability to travel across current. So instead of flowing with current and only being able to go one direction or two directions with the current, now we could go across the current without slowing down a lot. And then that opened up travel routes to create access in a more time efficient manner to more places, which allowed for more growth. And then to become less dependent on a lot of the major cities, especially at that time, were on the shoreline, near ports, near water, where shipping and receiving was more accessible, and or near rivers and canals. Then the creation of a more elaborate rail system, which needed steel to be able to do, which needed steam to have the locomotives, allowed for things to be moved inland more efficiently as well, and less dependent on being near water. So all those things that we talked about, not only inventions and technology, but we also have to have, with the growth that affords us, ways to support growth in infrastructure, construction, transportation, things like that. So the technologies, major ones that we still benefit from today, all came from a need to have each other. And then, so I talked about how the first industrial revolution kicked off in Great Britain. And then ultimately, it also starts to bleed over into their colonies in the Western Hemisphere that we here in Huntsville, Alabama, call the United States now. So in 1776, a lot of things happened. The steam engine was, James Watt kind of introduced his version of it. The Wealth of Nations was published. The United States declared independence in 1776. And at the time, Great Britain prohibited people from immigrating to its former colonies or any other nations if they worked in technology. In other words, they didn't want people with the technical knowledge of things going somewhere else and sharing that knowledge. So people would have to immigrate under the guise of being something different. And they called that intellectual piracy, one of my favorite terms that I've discovered in all my years of preparing notes, intellectual piracy. And one of the most famous examples of that was Samuel the Trader Slater, who grew up working in textile mills in England since the age of 10 and memorized a great deal of the technologies of both how the mills ran and how the equipment was made. Memorized. There's no emailing, taking pictures, anything like that, and immigrated as a farmer in adulthood and was instrumental in working to help establish the first U.S. textile mill in Rhode Island. So that's an interesting phenomenon, the intellectual piracy. So I believe Andrew Jackson called him the father of the American Industrial Revolution, and the British called him Slater the Trader. One of the more famous inventors during this time in the U.S., and again, due to the increase in textile demand, increased raw material demand, increased the need to more efficiently harvest popular crop, cotton, that was raw material for this new wave of textiles. So Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin, which mechanically separated cotton seeds from fibers and reduced the amount of manual labor that went into that and greatly increased the amount of cotton that could be produced, made that much more efficient. And that's not all that he did. Eli Whitney is also given credit for something we'll see pop up in the second industrial revolution, the idea of interchangeable parts, which means when I'm building something and an individual piece goes wrong, maybe I can just replace that instead of scrapping the whole thing. So now if I'm driving my truck and the tire goes flat, maybe I could interchange it with a new tire instead of having to get a whole new truck. And he demonstrated the ability, supposedly, by winning a contract to build rifles, muskets, for the U.S. government, and showing that if a individual parts on the rifle failed, how quickly just that individual part could be replaced in the field without a problem, which was a huge advantage. More importantly, interchangeable parts become foundational, as we see in the second industrial revolution, to something called mass production and the assembly line. But to make parts interchangeable, you need some level of precision in their production. In other words, if I'm going to just take this piece off and replace it with another piece, they kind of need to line up. Whereas if I was just making my one rifle, then I can make it all fit the first time and not have to worry about it replacing a piece lining up because I wasn't going to replace it. So he also is known for perfecting the milling machine for precision machine as well. And again, one of the things I really wanted to point out in all of this, I will probably do very little asking you who invented what, and definitely probably not a what year was something invented. I mean, this is engineering management. I'm going to test you on engineering management principles, not history. I think some of it's important. You'll have access to it in case I'm lying and accidentally do ask a question like that. But I want you to understand how all of these ideas are interrelated. Develop precision machining. Well, one of the reasons is because I need to produce things precision for my interchangeable parts. The cotton gin made sense to develop when the high demand for cotton through textiles became available. That high demand was only meetable when we created inventions to make the textile production much more productive. But to make it much more productive, we had to have more steel to build more factories and build more machines and build transportation to get to and from those. And to make more steel, we needed more coal. And so all of that ties together. Which leads us to shifting to, if all of the technologies themselves were interrelated, just in the technology side, what effect does that have when we introduce these technologies into society? So we're going to look at the people aspects that changed during this time based on the technologies of the first industrial revolution and introduce you, if you are not familiar with them, to a group of lovely people called the Luddites. Has anyone heard of the Luddites? You are in for a treat. So in 1811, in Great Britain, there became a rash of instances where the new factories were being broken into and the new weaving and spinning machines were being damaged and vandalized. And this was done by a group of skilled laborers who, guess what, were highly skilled craftsmen, spinners, and weavers, who all of a sudden saw these machines who could do what they prided themselves as being able to do faster, and people with less skill able to operate them as a threat. And they had arguments against it. Hey, the stuff that they're making is lower quality. The people who are making it are less reliable, but that's kind of what happened. So they started breaking into factories and damaging things. They called it collective bargaining by riot. And so they called themselves the Luddites. They began attributing these acts, breaking in, smashing machines, to someone called Loyd or General Loyd or Ned Loyd. That became just the name that was adopted to the spirit of the movement. And so throughout the spring and summer of 1811, starting in Nottingham, is Nottingham known for anything else to anybody? Heard of Robin Hood? Robin Hood come out of Nottingham as well. So it became so rampant. This blows my mind. It became so rampant that Great Britain was actually dedicating more resources during this time to combating these protests and acts of vandalism than they were dedicating to fighting Napoleon and then Napoleon, of course, at the time. Because it's threatening the manufacturing infrastructure of the country. And it began, the actions continued to get more violent and ultimately started leading to deaths. Destroyed a lot of equipment, but it also led to, they called it collective bargaining through rioting. Wage levels becoming more restored. They had initially, when the factory system was introduced, they were like, hey, we can pay lower skilled labor less to make these textiles at a higher volume. So that began to level back out. Kind of introduced the groundwork for organized labor unions. And to back up our point that everything starts to lead in that cycle, we introduce technologies. Society reacts to technologies, good or bad, good and or bad. Those reactions lead to changes, often in policies and procedures in organizations or laws and regulations in the government. So in this case, because of the Luddites, in Great Britain, they introduced something called the Frame Breaking Act, which increased the punishment for factory and machine destruction to punishable by death or permanent relocation. And so that ended the Luddite protest. It's like, oh, stakes were a little higher now, and kind of squelched it. But again, all of those things started to lead to each other. Some other policy changes that came about as a byproduct of the technologies being introduced that led to the factory system and the societal effects of that, which led to poor working conditions in a lot of these situations. In factories, the owners of the factories were known to work people long hours, 16 hours a week. Very few breaks. And again, this is the first time on a scale people are showing up to the same place in a centralized area working. So it's not like all these boundaries of work that we have now that are in place existed. It's like, oh, how long can we work these people before they drop? So then they start seeing exhaustion, injuries, deaths, poor working conditions, poor working environments. And the coal mines, it was even worse. Confined areas, they paid them more. Remember in the Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith, his list of what makes some jobs worth more than others. One of those was if it's less desirable and fewer people want to do it. Well, oftentimes it'll pay higher wages. If it's more dangerous, it's physically difficult, confined spaces, coal dust. I did a lot of work over about 12 years on and off with the Alabama State Port Authority at the Port of Mobile in the southern part of the state. Doing lean projects and strategic planning and things. And they have several different operations down there. And one of them is a coal terminal, McDuffie Coal Terminal. They, at the time, were the second largest import coal terminal in the South behind New Orleans. So worked around a lot of coal. They would get coal ships in from Colombia, unloaded, put coal onto barges or trains and move it inland to for power plants. We'd also export coal to Europe for steel making. Coal is not coal. They have different makeups that are better for different applications. So it's very harsh. Many days I get back to the hotel room, and just when you think you've showered enough, you have to take 3 more to get all of that off, and then you have it just all over. Everybody was going to work. So women, children were in the workplace. So a lot of disadvantages with that. A lot of the machines required more nimble hands, and so a lot of the owners thought that women had more dexterous hands that were more productive. They paid them less, and it also created a strain because you're also taking the women away from home at the time and putting them to work, so it creates the strain back as well during that time in society. And even more fun, we're bringing kids to work. It's like, oh, both the mom and the dad have to work. Might as well make it a family affair and bring the kids. While they're here, let's put them to work. They were very kind, though. We needed to be at least 5. It created very dangerous situations. And even more scary from a societal standpoint, you have everybody, all members of the family working. Then you become dependent on all 3 members of the family working, and it just becomes a vicious cycle. Kind of like you had this joke I always said, I have a really nice bass boat that I bought with money that I earned working overtime. And I never get to use that bass boat because I'm always working overtime to pay for it. So that was kind of the situation there. Children were nice and convenient to send under equipment because they were small. They could get their little pointy fingers in places that adults had more trouble getting them to. And again, all that just created the same thing in the coal mines. They could get to areas deeper in the mines to allow to mine more coal. So all these things that started to bubble up led to a series of reforms in labor called the Factory Acts. Thank goodness, right? So I just talked about all the social dynamics that happened with poor working conditions when we introduced this new way of doing work, but it also led to reform once we realized how bad that was. So that's that cycle that I want to point out that keeps happening over the industrial revolutions. So there was a series of them. The first Factory Acts were introduced to put limits on what could be done and expected of children in the workforce, limiting the number of hours, limiting the ages, limiting if they could work at night or not, implementing inspectors, original OSHA to enforce that they followed these laws, and ultimately added to those to limit working conditions for women and other people as well. And the social politics in the US, from the mechanization, the cotton gin, the demand for cotton led to the need for labor, which led to the plantation slavery, which ultimately was a major part of the US Civil War, which was bubbling up toward the end of the first industrial revolution and beginning of the 1860 to 1860. And again, all of these events, one of my biggest things in teaching the class this way is to point out how the 3 Ps work off of each other. and how we're going to see that happen over time. We had a change in principles and philosophy. We introduced the Wealth of Nations. We had inventions in the textile industry. People were more willing to do that with the free market view of the economy. Then we needed more power. That created the need for coal and steam and steel. That all fed off of each other. And the role of the engineer. So the role of management typically gets shaped with these principles and philosophies. The role of the engineer typically is on the processes and technology side. And in the first industrial revolution, the role of the engineer, like we introduced in the first class, was to invent, design, and build stuff. And that's what we saw them do: invent, design, and build textile equipment, steam engines, locomotives, railroads, ways of making steel. All that led to societal aspects, people aspects, the factory system. The introduction of the technology in the textile industry led to the Luddites revolt, resistance to technology. The introduction of all these new workforce practices led to unsafe work practices, and then that led to law changes, which reshaped the next wave of principles and philosophies. So what we will see in this second industrial revolution, which we'll kick off with in the next actual class that we'll have, is management principles that begin to form within the confines. We're going to introduce a guy named Max Weber, who introduced the laws and guidelines of bureaucracy within which you should set up an organization. Henri Fail, who introduced administrative management, the 5 functions of management, all within the guidelines of somebody saying, oh, based on what we learned, based on the reactions of the last time we introduced technologies and the societal reactions and the workforce practices that led to these new laws, we've got a new set of management principles that we're going to govern organizations by. And what's tricky is these things don't happen immediately, these reactions. The Luddites didn't immediately revolt the minute textile equipment was made. Oops, 50 years later, 40, 50 years later. Quality of living didn't go up immediately when things got more productive with the factory system and urbanization, but ultimately it did. We call that a delay in the system between a cause and effect. And then systems thinking, something that we talk about in, if you're unfortunate enough to go on and have me for EM 747, Strategic Engineering Management, talk about strategic thinking. I talk about systems thinking in a book called The Fifth Discipline. And he talks about delays in these interrelated circles, causal circles. The further a cause and effect are in time, the less likely people are to associate them. So if we can start to understand these delays at each phase, based on what we've learned from previous industrial revolutions, my hypothesis is, as engineering managers, maybe we can start to anticipate those in the future, and it will help us see the bigger picture and think more forward how we go about both engineering and management to more effectively manage the cycle. So that's where my head was when the first time I taught this class in 2019, when we resurrected the engineering management program here. I didn't teach it this way, this course. I covered a lot of the same course material that we're going to cover this semester, but I didn't do it chronologically, and I didn't do it framed around the 3 P's: processes, people, and principles being interrelated. But then I was also just coming off of my career working with manufacturing companies and hearing people talk about Industry 4.0. I'm like, what in the world is that? What was 3.0 and 2.0? And started doing my research and saying that, oh, this is telling a fascinating story. So in the second industrial revolution, we're going to see administrative management introduced as principles and philosophies. We're going to see something called scientific management introduced. We're going to see process of the role of the engineer. They're going to continue to invent, design, and build stuff. We're going to see additional advances in power and transportation and things that we saw in the first industrial revolution. They'll also take on a role of being more productive with the technologies that are being introduced. So we'll see how the role of the engineer evolves and the role of the manager becomes established. And of course, that's going to have aspects of that are going to pop up with people too. We're going to talk about the early research around workforce motivation and how that impacted the workforce and all of that fun stuff. How you doing? Any thoughts on it?
How did they like pass around the world or like the word about like these new acts? Because I remember I read somewhere where it said that some factories, based on their boss or upper level, that they didn't really follow the rules or made them changes for the workers.
Yeah, good question. And from the front end of that, from a communication standpoint, I'm not quite sure. But then like from a once you know it and you're just not doing it standpoint, kind of just briefly touched on it, that's where the need for implementing auditors and inspectors to make sure they're following the rules. And that happens to this day.
Yeah.
I have worked in plenty of places where I saw plenty of OSHA violations that because there just aren't enough inspectors to make sure everybody does everything.
Yeah, and like mostly like well also like focusing like on the frame breaking act, like how do they like really put it into like a stuff or like showing the stuff or showing the relocation in front of people to frighten them, I guess.
That's an interesting sociological question I don't have the answer to and would be really, yeah, like there's one thing to say we've passed this law, right? There's another to enforce it. There's another, like you said, to enforce it very publicly to get people's attention.
Yeah.
No, I don't have the answers to that. That would be.
So I was curious, sir.
You got me curious too.
Yeah.
Of how that got carried out. Very interesting. Yeah, permanent relocation. The first several years ago, I took advantage of the Ancestry.com 14-day free trial. I'm like, I'm going to learn as much as I can in 2 weeks about my family. So I just followed the direct lineage, like dad, grandpa, his dad on both sides, mom, grandpa. Didn't get branched off to weird uncles or anything like that, which is ironic because that is my role in the family now, being the weird uncle. And the first Loyd to come to this country come on an indentured servitude boat in the 1600s, the Rappahannock in Virginia. Apparently convicted felon for breaking into a cobbler shop. So, come from a long line of sketchy people, I guess. The last name, some of you spell it this way, had 2 L's in it when they first came. I guess it got dropped off somewhere. And some handwritten census along the way. Like I said, my family is not known for spelling. So get it honest. Just think that's always an interesting story. But then like after the US declared independence, they used Australia to permanently relocate people as well.
And then were the Luddites, or am I pronouncing that wrong?
Luddites.
Luddites, were they men, women, and children, or just Or just.
Mostly men. Can't say there weren't women and children, but women and children really weren't doing the weaving the hand weaving at the time due to the strength that it took. More spinning maybe, but the weaving was highly intricate and a craft, which was that's why they were the most threatened, because they were the skilled craftsmen that were all of a sudden being replaced. And so I think one of the participation badges I have for this week is a discussion thread where we're like, what are some modern day versions of the Luddites? People who, due to some technology that has been introduced, all of a sudden they feel their job is threatened. And what kind of reaction are they taking due to that? It'll be an interesting discussion to follow. I see it every day. The way my job is done changed. COVID accelerated that. Like I said, fall of 2019, first time I taught this class, it was about 80% in person, 20% online. And it's completely flip-flopped now. So plenty in this industry is like, oh my gosh, I'm getting replaced. Maybe so. That's happening all over the place. We hear it all the time. So what are some modern versions of Luddites? What technology or new thing are they resisting because they feel threatened because they were once in this one position? Taxi drivers is a good example. Automation in factories, AI in everything, so specific instances of that. And then with that threat, that scary unknown technology, what are the people who are threatened the most doing to react? But then ultimately what we'll see in the second industrial revolution, we'll have a guy named Frederick Taylor, the pioneer of scientific management and industrial engineering, said every time processes get automated, every time automation is introduced, he called it labor-saving devices, people panic and think it's going to replace jobs. And ultimately what it does is increase productivity and make things more affordable and more accessible to more people, which increases demand, which increases jobs. And the difference is that the new jobs very often have a requirement for a different skill set than the previous ones. And so the ability to understand those delays and what skill sets the delays and what skill sets people might need to meet the new jobs and the quicker we can accelerate that, the quicker we can adapt as society. I think that'll be some interesting conversation, hopefully next time.
So for that participation, you're more looking at like a similar situation where technology is replacing jobs, and not necessarily like people are acting as extreme as the Luddites.
Correct.
Okay, like what are they trying to do to rectify it or to push it?
Exactly. I'm not looking for extreme reaction. I'm just saying, how are people resisting some kind of change or technology that is introduced these days? And can we relate to the Luddites? And can we relate to it maybe personally, but also just in other things that we've observed? And like I said, the taxi driver's reaction when Uber was introduced is a good version of that. And there's plenty of other ones. So have fun looking that up. Asking ChatGPT, whoever, what some modern examples of Luddites are. And I think I said you have to share the distinct and unique one that hasn't been mentioned in the thread yet. So
Get on it first.
So yeah, it'll encourage you to not do the student syndrome and wait till the last minute, that stuff's interesting to read. I use discussion threads and I use the participations as quick 1-point ways to reinforce different learning lessons in the course, keep people engaged on a consistent basis, and a way to interact. I'm not somebody that uses them to say you must leave these many comments or whatever. I want it to be an informative, hopeful thing. But this particular one always ends up with some pretty interesting stuff getting posted. Definitely worth checking it out several times during its week of existence. All right, so exam next week, so no in-class class. The exam will be available all day next Tuesday. You have 90 minutes once you start to take it, and good luck. I think y'all will do fine.
Who do you think's gonna win the Super Bowl?
You get it right, you get the point.
What do you think?
Seahawks will.
We go see.
I was gonna pick them or the Rams, the winner of that game. So.
Yeah, I thought like Broncos probably